Hello, everybody. Hope everything's going well for you. Everything's great over here. Hope I get to see you again soon. We are on week 30 of our American history. We're looking at some exciting stuff that happened. We're going to finish off the end of the war. If you remember, just before spring break, I wasn't able to get through the very end of what was happening in Europe after D-Day. So I'm going to cover that today. And then we'll see what goes on with the end of the war. And then, of course, what happens right after the war, known as the Cold War. All right. In 1944, there was an election, and you can remember probably that the president at the time was Franklin D. Roosevelt, and he ran again in 1944 for an unprecedented fourth term, and the only person to have done that. And you can see here that he won big, right? So he's a Democrat. He, of course, won the South, and he ran against a guy named Dewey, who we'll see him again soon. But he won big time. Look at the electoral vote, 81.5%. That is a landslide. Pretty amazing stuff right there. So he was certainly very popular. Still, we're in the middle of a war. Voters tend to stick with whoever they have during a war, during a crisis even. They don't like to change horses midstream, as it were. All right, so here's his vice president, Truman. Of course, typically I bring up vice presidents for one reason, so you can figure that one out. Okay, but here they are. Notice Franklin Roosevelt is looking a little aged here, and yeah, we'll see what happens there. So the war in Europe, we didn't quite finish what happened there. We saw the spectacular D-Day invasion that took place, and then the move through France, the liberation of Paris. And then moving out to get the Nazis out of France and push them back into Germany. And that's where I had to just kind of flash through there pretty quickly. So I'll cover that now. And mainly we're talking then, of course, about the Battle of the Bulge. So you see Germany over here. And the Germans had taken over Belgium, and they had completely taken over France. So now after the invasion came in, they got pushed all the way back here. And you see this line. So this is the German position line right here, and see how it bulges in right here. So this area right here is known as the bulge. And so what is going to happen here is that there's going to be a big push from the Allied forces, namely the Americans and the British. At this point in time, there's probably some French with them, French who had been waiting over in England all this time. The resistance, of course, was still working down in the southern part of France. So we're going to have a big push here. This is in December and January of 44 and 45. It happened to be a very cold winter, sadly. All right, so we're going to see. Here they are in the snow. They did develop, I don't know if they developed it, but they did certainly use white camo out here in this to hide in the snow. But it was just miserable cold. We're going to watch a couple of videos about it.
The Battle of the Bulge, December 16, 1944 through January 25, 1945, the Ardennes. Following the successful Normandy landings in June 1944 and the various landings in southern France, the Allied powers advanced quickly through France, faster than what the military leadership of both the Allies and Germany had anticipated. Due to this, the Allied troops were suffering from fatigue from weeks of combat. Supplies were dangerously low, and the supply lines themselves were extremely thin. Hitler decided that if the German army could quickly attack through the Belgian Ardennes forest, a weak quiet part in the Allied line, occupied by battle-weary units, and capture the Allies' supply port of Antwerp, he could split the Allied front in two. As a result of this, Hitler could make a separate peace with Britain and the USA rather than unconditional surrender and focus on Soviet Russia. This was all fantasy, and his commanders were not optimistic the offensive would go ahead. After a 2-hour artillery bombardment on the Allied lines, the attack, comprising of 200,000 German troops and almost 1,000 tanks of the 5th and 6th Panzer Armies and the 7th Army, began on the American forces on December 16, 1944. The German forces achieved complete surprise on the outnumbered American troops. Special forces caused confusion by sending in English-speaking German soldiers dressed up in U.S. uniforms who changed road signs and cut telephone wires. The bad weather for the moment was also too cloudy and foggy, which meant that the might of the Allied Air Force could not be used. Many U.S. units became overrun or had to surrender. Those that were not established a defense around road junctions at Saint-Vith and Bastogne. The difficult terrain of the Ardennes made a large-scale offensive unexpected, so it would take a while for the Allied High Command to accept that this was a major attack. While the Germans did see some success in the center, the Northern 6th Panzer Army's advance stalled within a few days. On December 18th, the 101st Airborne Division were surrounded by the Germans at Bastogne. Cold, starved, outnumbered, and low on ammunition, the 101st would hold out for 7 days against the German assault. On Christmas Eve, some German troops almost reached the River Meuse, but with little fuel, the German advance had reached its peak. On December 26th, General Patton's Third Army, which had completely turned around from its advance, relieved the 101st at Bastogne. The German resupply difficulties had grown, and the skies had cleared, allowing the Allied air power the ability to target German forces. The German blitzkrieg tactics also couldn't work in the heavily wooded, snowy forests, deep valleys, and narrow roads of the Ardennes. Even heavily armored vehicles such as the Germans' Tiger II heavy tank could not turn the tide because it consumed huge amounts of fuel. The U.S. forces began a counteroffensive on January 3rd. By this point, the German Panzer Division were so low on fuel, they abandoned a lot of their tanks. The U.S. counteroffensive regained all land lost during the German offensive by late January. The Battle of the Bulge was the largest battle fought by the Americans in World War II. Due to deep snow, cold temperatures, bad weather, and dwindling fuel reserves, the German Army and Air Force were unable to launch the crushing blow to the Allies Hitler had hoped for. While the attack is known as the Ardennes Offensive, the initial attack by the Germans created a triangular bulge that stretched for miles into the Allied front line, creating the commonly known name of Battle of the Bulge. The Americans suffered around 80,000 casualties, while the Germans had 100,000 casualties, and most of the tanks used in the offensive, which could not be replaced.
Okay, so you see it was tough going there at the Battle of the Bulge. It was a tough one. We're going to watch another short video here.
During the Bulge, command broke down, supplies broke down, morale broke down, communications broke down, everything broke down. It was every man for himself. We were inadequately clothed. We didn't have rubber overshoes, we didn't have overcoats, we didn't have gloves, we didn't have scarves. My boots were so bad, I would strip newspapers and drapery off of these bombed out houses and wrap my feet in it. You were having trouble breathing because the snow was suffocating you. And consequently, we lost a lot of men who froze to death.
Okay, so I like that footage because it showed actual footage of the fighting. There were cameramen who came along and joined alongside some of these troops. Furthermore, it showed some of it in color, so there was the color technology there. The Allies did push the Germans back into Germany, and of course crossing the Rhine would be the last step, right? Because the Rhine is what demarks France from Germany. And so getting across the Rhine was an important step for our guys. Here we see some guys crossing. Notice they're ducking down. That's because the Germans did defend the Rhine, okay? So they blew up all the bridges. There were very few bridges. I think there were only maybe 2 left at the end that would cross over the Rhine. And so then we see our guys coming over. They're being shot at. But the waves were just too many, and our guys just kept coming and coming, and the Germans were running out of everything. And you can see here we had a lot of German surrender going on at this point. So the end is near. This is, of course, Germany's last stand, essentially, was the defense of the Rhine. And the big 3 meet at Yalta. So here are our big 3, same as before, right? We have Winston Churchill of UK, of the United Kingdom, Franklin D. Roosevelt of the USA, and then Joseph Stalin of Russia over there. So where the Americans and British were coming in from the west, the Russians were coming in from the east. So we see that Germany was having to deal with the Russians on the other side. And so they're getting squeezed from both sides right here. So there's a little bit of a race, we'll see, to get to Berlin first. It's going to end up the Russians getting there first. They may have actually even made that deal, even at this place. So a place called Yalta, and the big 3 met, and they said, okay, we've got to put the last screws to the Germans so that we can end this thing. So they made a couple of decisions, and one of them, people look back now and say this was a horrifying thing to do, and that was called the Dresden Firestorm. Dresden is a city in Germany, and lots and lots of civilians living there. But also in Dresden, there were some large plants making weaponry, including possibly even a jet. So the Germans had developed a jet engine and a jet airplane called the V2. It hardly got to be used because the end of the war came too soon. So they didn't quite get the technology there in time. So the idea of the firestorm of Dresden essentially meant that the Allies were going to drop lots and lots of incendiary bombs on this beautiful city. So an incendiary bomb, as you recall, is the one when it hits, and not only does it explode, but it sends out inflammable material that causes the whole place to burn. So essentially we just burned the city down and blew it up. This is how it looked. You can see lots of destruction there, lots of buildings knocked down. There were lots of people killed, including civilians. So historians will look back on this and criticize the Allies for going to such, because the end was so obviously coming. But they didn't know that for absolutely sure, and they wanted to get rid of those weaponry factories. And so you can go back and do some research on this and see if you think it was justified. Here's another picture of it. We're looking from on high here, from a church probably. That's a statue probably from a Lutheran church. And you can see how all those places are just bombed out or burned out. So tragic. So now how can they end the war? We're going to see it's coming on to the month of April here pretty soon, which is going to be a huge game changer all around. April of 1945, but the big 3 are still coming up with certain plans, and especially the Americans. All right, this is a letter written to the president from this man on the left. You probably recognize him. That is Albert Einstein, and he wrote the letter to the president to warn him. And his warning was that he was pretty sure that the Germans were coming up with a type of bomb that would be so destructive the world had never seen it before. We call that an atomic bomb. And he said, you need to understand that atomic bomb would use radioactive materials, and those materials not only would be destructive, but also deadly, even deadly for a time afterwards. And so his letter was really encouraging the president to get started on his own bomb. All right, this letter had come a lot earlier than 1945. The president had read it and had taken it to heart and had secretly been working on a plan to develop a nuclear bomb. Nobody knew about it except the scientists involved. This project was known as the Manhattan Project. The guy who was ahead of it is this man right here. His name is Robert Oppenheimer, a brilliant man, and he was tapped by the president to come in and discover, could this be done? The Germans had been working on it. It had not been done before. It required a lot of physics and manipulation of radioactive materials. Could it be done? And Robert Oppenheimer put the numbers to the paper, and he told the president he believed it could be done. And so we began the Manhattan Project in various locations all across. You can even see up in Canada some places. There were certain components being put together and manufactured for use in this particular project. Los Alamos, New Mexico, right here, would be the main area where the scientists were working. They were working in New Mexico because there was a lot of open area that was uninhabited. Down here, we're going to see in a little bit, Alamogordo is going to be the spot where the Project Trinity will take place. These other places over here are doing various things, namely, when you use a radioactive material, for instance, uranium, polonium, those materials have to be more purified in the sense that, for instance, uranium is an element, right? And it's found naturally in the earth, and about 95% of it is regular old uranium, but that other 5%, probably less, I'm just pulling numbers out of the air here, is the type of uranium that is unstable. And when it's unstable, you probably remember this from chemistry or physical science, when it's unstable, it can fall apart all on its own. That's called radioactivity. So in order to get enough to make a bomb, they had to extract out of vast amounts of uranium, they had to extract just the type of uranium that is radioactive and the type of polonium. So these different areas over here were all using different machines like centrifuges and things like this to extract the type of uranium that they wanted to use, or the type of polonium that they wanted to use. So lots of work going around all over the whole country, but Los Alamos was the main research place, okay, and furthermore, where they were building the actual bombs. Then came April of 1945. Like I told you, it was a very big month in the world. First of all, Benito Mussolini, who you recall had been arrested by his own people after the Americans had come in through Sicily. Remember, Patton came in through Sicily and then up the boot of Italy. And remember who he was fighting, who the Americans were fighting in Italy. They were not fighting Italians. They were fighting Germans, because the Italians had changed sides by that point. They had switched over and become part of the Allies. So the Italians were with us now, and Mussolini was arrested by the Italians. I don't know if you recall, he was put on a mountaintop and to be kept safely, arrested up there, and the Nazis rescued him. It's a fabulous story where they came in with gliders and were able to rescue Mussolini, take him back to Germany. So he had been staying in Germany for a while. Now he made his way back to reconquer Italy and come into Italy, but they captured him and they actually executed him at this point in time. So he was charged with war crimes and found guilty and executed. So April 1945, Benito Mussolini is dead. Then, also in April 1945, Hitler was trapped in Berlin. He had the Russians coming in and they literally took the city. He was hiding in a bunker underground, and he apparently got married to his girlfriend Eva Braun, and then as the story goes, you can look this one up if you like, because there's lots of controversy. Was it true? Was it not? Was he still alive? This kind of thing. Anyway, he and his new wife took their own lives, along with other Nazis who were around in the area. Some stayed on to try to fight, but they, of course, knew it was over. Everyone knew it was over. So now it's April. We've got Mussolini dead. We've got Hitler dead. And sadly, one more death took place. Same month, April 12th, 1945. Franklin D. Roosevelt was actually at his home in the countryside. I'm not sure which one. I don't think it was Campobello. And he was actually sitting for a portrait that was being painted. And during the session or thereafter, shortly, he just fell over and he just died. He was old, and he had underlying problems. So here he is. He has died. He was beloved, had just been reelected to his 4th term. And look, he was in Warm Springs. Okay, so it says here brain hemorrhage was the final cause of that. Here is a picture of his funeral. Of course, all the people came out. War's still going on. The people are very worried and upset about that. Of course, their boys all going off to war. But now their president, the one who was leading them to sure victory that was it was on the horizon. They could see it coming. He's now gone. And they are left with the vice president, Harry S. Truman, who now becomes the president. It's a somber occasion when he's taking the oath because the previous president has died, rather than just being elected to it. But here he is, and he becomes president number 33. And now he's thrown into the whole milieu of the war. He's now going to have to go meet with Churchill and Stalin over here, and they're deciding on the end of the war. So big shoes to fill for Harry S. Truman. One of the things that was going on in Europe at this time was our armies kept moving inward towards, through Germany and then in through Poland. And as they were doing this, they were starting to liberate the concentration camps that were there. Our armies were looking for our POWs. So American POWs who had been taken at previous times are now going to be rescued by our guys. And as they were doing that, they came across these giant concentration camps, the ones where the Jews were. There had been some inclination that there were these Jewish concentration camps. We knew they were there, that they were death camps. But now it became very, very clear that that's indeed what was going on. And these, all the guys in the camps, the POW camps and the concentration camps, were all delighted to see American troops coming in. Here we even have Dwight Eisenhower coming into one of the camps and liberating these people, bringing them food, and health care and this kind of thing that they had been lacking all this time. So we have the heroes coming in to rescue. And then we had the official surrender of Germany. Whoever was left, I think it was Heinrich Himmler or somebody was left. Maybe it wasn't Himmler. And they finally do surrender, and we have what's known as VE Day. That stands for Victory in Europe Day. The last of the German units yield here. Big celebrations over there, over in America, all over the world, really. Meanwhile, the Japanese are still fighting. Okay, so the war is not over. And remember that part of the war, the Pacific Front, was almost exclusively American troops over there, because the British troops who had previously been there had all been put into concentration camps. When I say all, a good number of them. And so we're still looking. So Harry S. Truman is now looking at the Manhattan Project, and he knew zero about it. President Roosevelt had not told his vice president a single thing about the Manhattan Project. So he was shocked to find out that we had this technology. They had been working for several years now, and at this point they're very convinced that their work is paying off, that it will work, it can be done. So now it's going to fall to Harry Truman to decide if this strongest bomb ever made would be used to end the war against the Japanese. It was called the Gadget. So this was the first one. They had to test it because they didn't know. They thought, well, I think in theory it should work, but we don't know if it will. There's this fabulous sequence of events that has to take place in order for a nuclear bomb to be able to explode. And that, and so they weren't sure if it was going to do it. It had never been done before. And so they had the first one they were going to test, called the Gadget. This is the tower. So now they're down there in Alamogordo, out in the middle of the desert, nobody living there. And this is the tower, and the this Gadget would have been hanging somewhere, probably here somewhere on the tower. And then they would commence the beginning of the nuclear reaction that was going to go on in there, where they have the chain reaction. And so the chain reaction, one neutron gets hit to another neutron to another, and it spreads out and spreads out and spreads out to the point then we have the explosion. All right, so they're going to test it, and it's called the Trinity test in July of 1945. And they left it sitting in that tower. They all moved a action, and it worked. There it is. So we see the typical mushroom cloud that is created from this. So we have a huge amount of heat. and then the cloud coming up right here, and then that cloud will create a blast. It's called a nuclear blast, and it literally will just knock flat anything in the vicinity. And so these guys were all hiding behind, they were in trenches and things a distance away. I will say that it was actually quite dangerous, and many of them ended up with nuclear poisoning. Some of them got cancer, this kind of thing. So it was not a safe thing for most of them. This is what's left of the tower afterwards and the gadget. And if you see, they're all wearing on their feet some little boots that are supposedly, I don't know, protecting them from the radiation. But they're not wearing anything else. They should be in hazmat suits or something. But, you know, live and learn, right? The sand in the area, it was a desert, was heated so much that it was actually turned to glass. And here's a little piece of it right here. So that's the sand that's been turned to glass. It has a special name. I can't remember the name of it right now. But of course it's radioactive. So you don't want to collect this for your rock collection right there. So they had two other ones that they are going to be using now. Now that they know that the gadget worked, these two are going to operate under the same principle, although Little Boy right here is going to be using uranium-235, and Fat Man is going to be using plutonium-239. Okay, so they're different fuels, but it's the same concept, the same process that's going to be used. All right, the decision now has to be made. Will they indeed use this against Japan? If you remember last week, we talked about those invasions of Japan. Remember Okinawa, how horrible Okinawa was. That was an amphibious landing of our guys landing on the beach, and it was horrible. And they realized that that would be multiplied by many if they were going to try to make a D-Day style landing on the actual island of Japan, you know, where Tokyo is, on Honshu over there. And so they had to, Harry Truman had to make this decision. Was it worth putting all our guys on the beach like that, or should we just use this bomb? So that's a good moral question to ask. As you probably know, we decided to use the bomb. This is the ship that actually took the components of the bomb. It looks like here the uranium fuel for Little Boy was being taken over to be, you know, put into the bomb so it could be used. So they succeeded. The ship continued on to go fight. It's a battleship, and we're going to see it got actually struck. There it goes, boom, by a torpedo, a Japanese torpedo, and or a couple of them. And it sunk very quickly, and many of the guys were killed instantly on the ship. So had this been done before they dropped off the fuel, history certainly would have been changed. But this happened after they had dropped off the uranium for the bomb. And the guys that survived, here are some of them. They did get rescued. Many of them got rescued over here, but while they were waiting to be rescued, they were in the ocean and sharks came around. It's just horrible, right? So not only are they dealing with the trauma of having gone through this explosion, probably some burns and things like this, they also now have sharks to deal with. They were eventually rescued on a ship here, and we can see them recovering here, but it was horrible. So that's USS Indianapolis. The plane that's going to take the bomb. Now these guys get the golden ticket, if you will. They're going to be the ones holding on to Little Boy and dropping it over a city that was chosen based on where it was and what was being made there. So once again, this is going to be the city in Japan called Hiroshima that had plants that were making weaponry. And so they decided, of course there were civilians there as well, but they chose that city, and they chose this crew, and the captain of this crew is a guy named Paul Tibbets. There's Tibbets right there. It was a top secret deal. You know, many people had no idea that we even had the bomb at all. I mean, so this was very secret, and even of the crew on here, it was all hush hush. So the ship is called the plane is called the Enola Gay, and they're gonna head in. They have very specific instructions on how to do this. Now, this is, this is an actual picture at the time, but the idea here is the bomb's going to be dropped. It doesn't hit the ground. Okay, this is not how this works. It gets the reaction gets started, so the chain reaction gets started, set in motion. The bomb gets dropped, and it explodes actually way up and off the ground, and it shoots this powerful downward thrust here, and then upward, of course, becomes that mushroom cloud. And remember I told you about the blast? Well, this plane had to hightail it out of there so that the blast didn't actually wreck the plane. So as they dropped the bomb, and boy howdy, they are moving out of there. And furthermore, the blast did push them, but it did not damage the plane. It did not damage the people. They got, it was a successful mission. It hit the city of Hiroshima. There was no warning to the Japanese that we had this. It was August 6th, 1945. It's supposed to say Hiroshima up there to the right. And this is the actual cloud. So this was an actual photo taken at the time. And here's the city. So just utter devastation. The people who were at ground zero where the blast came down were incinerated. Other people who were outward had clothes blown off of them. Burns from that. Many people who survived the blast later came down with cancer due to the radiation that was put out by the bomb. All right, so that's another tough one right there. And then the warning was given to the Japanese, surrender now or there's going to be another bomb. And the Japanese refused to surrender. So the decision was made to drop Fat Man. Okay, that's August 9th, 1945. A different city obviously was chosen. And we're going to see this is the cloud over Nagasaki. So Nagasaki is the second city that was founded. Interestingly, there wasn't as much damage. The bomb was just as horrifying, but the damage, it had to do with the mountains that were surrounding it in some way around Nagasaki. So that's an interesting study there. All right, so now actually the Americans did threaten to drop another bomb. We did not have another bomb, so that was a little bit of a bluff there. But Japan surrendered, and of course now we are looking at the actual end of the war. Okay, Hirohito accepted that. I think Tojo attempted to take his own life, but we rescued him and then tried him, and I think executed him. I know, we'll have to look that one up. Here is the signing of the surrender. It was unconditional surrender. We see Douglas MacArthur over here on board the ship. I think it was the Missouri, I think. And we have the, this is not the emperor. This is the representative of the emperor who is signing the surrender papers. I believe the emperor did make a radio announcement to his people about the surrender, and it was one of the very few times they had ever heard his voice at all, because he was considered this, holy person, and he didn't deign to actually speak to the people. But he did tell them that the surrender had taken place. So when we have a question about the morality of dropping the bomb, we're gonna watch this little video of a guy who's gonna give us an idea about that. See what you think.
President Harry S. Truman's decision to use atomic weapons against the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki proved to be one of the most controversial decisions in American history. As the years have passed, the controversy has only intensified. More and more people, both in America and abroad, have condemned both President Truman and America for that decision. But this criticism is based on limited historical knowledge of both the situation Truman confronted and the basis for his decision. Such flawed analysis has been aided by the unfortunate influence of some very bad history, such as that written by members of the so-called atomic diplomacy school. These historians disgracefully alleged that Truman proceeded to drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan, which he knew was on the verge of surrender, so as to intimidate the Soviet Union in the already developing Cold War. That specious interpretation must be refuted fully. Truman sought to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 2 major military-industrial targets, to avoid an invasion of Japan, which Truman knew would mean, in his words, quote, an Okinawa from one end of Japan to the other, end quote. His assumptions were entirely legitimate. By July of 1945, the Japanese had been subjected to months of devastating attacks by American B-29s. Their capital and other major cities had suffered extensive damage, and the home islands were subjected to a naval blockade that made food and fuel increasingly scarce. Japanese military and civilian losses had reached approximately 3 million, and there seemed no end in sight. Despite all this, however, Japan's leaders, and especially its military, clung fiercely to notions of getsu-go, decisive battle. In fact, the Japanese government had mobilized a large part of the population into a national militia which would be deployed to defend the home islands. Confirming the Japanese determination to fight on is the fact that even after the use of the atomic bombs against both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese military still wanted to pursue that desperate option. The atomic bombs forced Emperor Hirohito to understand clearly, and in a way his military leaders refused to comprehend, that the defense of the homeland was hopeless. It took the unprecedented intervention of a Japanese emperor to break the impasse in the Japanese government and finally order surrender. It was only the dropping of the atom bombs that allowed the emperor and the so-called peace faction in the Japanese government to negotiate an end to the war. All the viable alternate scenarios to secure American victory, all would have meant significantly greater American and Allied casualties and much higher Japanese civilian and military casualties. According to American military estimates at the time, those numbers would have been well above 1 million. Hard as it may be to accept, Japanese losses would have been far greater without the bombs. And the overall casualties would also have included thousands of Allied prisoners of war whom the Japanese planned to execute in case of invasion. Truman's use of the bomb should be seen as his choosing the least awful of the options available to him. Even in retrospect, far removed from the pressures that Truman faced in 1945, his critics can offer no serious and convincing proposal regarding a viable and less costly alternative. The judgment of history is clear and unambiguous. The atomic bombs shortened the war, averted the need for a land invasion, saved countless more lives on both sides of the blood-soaked conflict than they cost, and ended the Japanese brutalization of the conquered peoples of Asia. Given the alternatives, what would any moral person have done in Truman's position? I'm Father Wilson Miscamble, Professor of History at Notre Dame for Prager University.
Okay, well that's interesting to consider all of the things that we're looking at there, right? So now we have Victory in Japan Day, VJ Day, 1945. This is a famous photo that was taken. It's from Life magazine. It was taken in Times Square, New York City. It's an interesting story. The sailor grabbed a nurse and kissed her. He did not know her. She did not know him. In fact, they didn't even talk after that. So they didn't know each other even afterwards. It's funny, I think something like 50 years later, on the 50th anniversary or something, there was some research done by different historians and journalists, and they actually located these two people and brought them together to meet each other. Yeah, so that's kind of a fun story. But this became a very, very famous photo, and it's been turned into statues and whatnot, so you probably recognize it. Now we have our POWs in the Pacific area that need freedom as well, and so we had several of them. Remember, we talked about the people that were put in Cabanatuan in the Philippines, so we'll get to them. But we also had the Japanese camps. We had where some of our nurses were. Remember those ones from Philippines as well. And then we had in Burma a lot of British who had been taken prisoner. And even in the Indochina area, we had Japanese camps with Allied soldiers in them who had been kept prisoner. I believe these right here we're looking at, I believe these are British actually, that were rescued by Americans coming in and brought them food. I believe they are in Burma. Cabanatuan is the camp that was in the Philippines, and they actually rescued these guys while the Japanese were still there. So here we are. They're in the Philippines, which is a very tropical environment. It's very hot, right? Lots of insects and things like this. They're being kept in these little, huts. If you've seen the movie called The Great, what's it called? The Great Raid. It's about this. So what happened in 1945? This is January 1945. See, so well before the bombs. They are going to be rescued. It's actually quite an exciting event that took place right here. We have the American troops, along with Filipino troops, who are going to come in and take over the camp from the Japanese, called the Great Raid. And here they get rescued right here. So it was a huge success. The Japanese had not surrendered yet, mind you. So they fought against it. I believe this is some actual footage. I don't think there's any sound of the guys coming out. So if you get a chance to watch the movie The Great Raid, I know it has Joseph Fiennes in it. You can tell me that and, get some extra credit there. Here they're being rescued. They're, thin, of course, because they haven't been fed very well. There we go. I thought I had a picture of the movie poster in there. I guess I don't. But it's called The Great Raid, made, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or so. In Burma, also known as Myanmar, we had the POW camps here too, but these guys had been put to work by the Japanese to build a railroad through some dense jungle right here. They had to cut away jungle. They had to move rocks. I don't even think they were using any kind of machinery or dynamite or anything like this. It was just brutal work. Many men, especially British, some Australians, and some Americans, they called it the Death Railway because just working on this railway caused the death of these guys, with the heat, with the tropical diseases, and then with the hard work. They were building that railroad, the Burma Railway. Here are some of those guys. I also believe these are British who are in their little cabin right here. The movie called The Bridge on the River Kwai is around that same area that was part of, we're building a bridge for the railway. This is when the story of Louis Zamperini comes in. You may have seen this story, also a movie called Unbroken, is that right? And he was on a ship that had been sunk, and he has a great story because before all this, he was an Olympian. He had run, I think he won a Olympic medal in one of our Olympics, and then he goes on to be a sailor. And after his ship was bombed, he got put into a concentration camp. And I can't remember where his concentration camp was, but one of those areas in the Pacific, very tropical, this kind of thing. And I'm not sure if that's his actual camp picture to the right, if he's there, but notice those guys also very, very thin, not well fed. And Zamperini actually survived that as well. So he survived the bombing, he survived the camp. And then he went on, the rest of his story is that he went to a Billy Graham crusade after he came back, and had some, what they called back in the day, shell shock, but we call it post-traumatic stress disorder. And he accepted Christ at a Billy Graham crusade. A great story about Louis Zamperini. He lived for a long time. I think he just passed away maybe a few years ago. The Nuremberg war trials were now starting up. Nuremberg is a city in Germany, and they chose that city. I guess it didn't have as much damage or whatever. They brought in Allied people, so American and British, and I think even French, to act as judges, and they're going to judge these war criminals, namely the Nazis that are there. Right here, this is that Hess right here? He's the one who had been shot down over Scotland and been a prisoner in England for many years. Remember, Hitler's not there. He's already gone. But these guys are all going to be tried for as war criminals and be convicted. Most of them will be. I think some of them, their conviction led to the rest of their life in jail. Some of them had executions, this kind of thing. There's also a good movie on this called Judgment at Nuremberg that goes through all of this. We have the big three. Notice who they are now. And we're at the conference. This is after the war. We have a new American. Obviously, Harry Truman is going to be there. Also, look, a new British guy. Instead of Churchill, we have Clement Attlee. So the British had actually voted out Churchill, which is sort of a slap in the face. He'll actually become prime minister again a little bit later. toward the end of his life. But he had really managed the war beautifully, and now the people are ready to move on, I guess. Stalin, of course, is a dictator, so nobody can vote him out. He's still there as one of. So these are our new big three, and they're going to come up with now. What do we do with the post-war world? How do we manage this? Because it had been an uneasy alliance with the Russians, because Joseph Stalin, of course, is a communist, and who can trust communists, right? So he wasn't like someone we agreed with in any kind of political sense. So now he's going to be looking for his part of the winnings, if you will, and the Americans and British are looking to extend freedom, right? Rebuilding Europe was top of their list. It had been devastated by the war. Germany, in particular, England. France was pretty much free from any kind of damage, remember, because they didn't really have much fighting there, except over on the border area. Belgium had some trouble as well. So we brought in this man, George Marshall. He was General Marshall, who is going to come up with a plan. And that plan is known as the Marshall Plan, where we're going to use American money and Allied money. You can see those different flags over there representing everybody who's pitching in. We're going to take that money and start to rebuild all the areas, including, by the way, Germany. So they didn't want to go through that punishing deal like it had happened in Versailles. They're going to instead use, the goodness, if you will, to rebuild so that everybody else can recover and not feel the need to go to war again. So this is sort of a before and after, I guess, going on here of one city here that's now going to be improved and built up under the Marshall Plan. Germany was the big question. What to do with Germany? Because the communists wanted part of it, and then the Americans and the French and the British wanted to keep the other parts free. So we divided it up into 4 chunks. So we have the British zone, the American zone, the French zone, and the Soviet zone. And notice Berlin and where it is. Look, Berlin's the capital right here. It's smack in the middle of what's going to be called now, from now on, East Germany. All right, so now Berlin was an important enough city that all the other allies said, well, hold on a minute, we can't give all of Berlin to the Soviets, so we're going to also divide Berlin up. By the way, the British, American, and French zone joined together to be known as West Germany. So here it is. You can see West Germany and East Germany. And then we're going to take Berlin and have East Berlin and West Berlin. Okay? So this is in 48, French, British, American zones of Germany and the zones of Berlin. All right, which is going to lead to something known as the Berlin Wall. So we can see here that French, British, and American sectors over here, this will be West Berlin, and all of this will be the Soviet sector, or East Berlin, okay? And things will be quite different on both sides politically. And you can see here that here's Germany, all right, here's Berlin. At first, what happened was, let me go back real quick. At first, what happened was that the Soviet sector right here didn't allow anybody to come in, because to get in, of course, you had to come in way into what is known as East Germany. And so they said, no, you can't come in. And so the people in West Berlin started to suffer from not having enough supplies. So the Allies started the Berlin Airlift, and the Berlin Airlift was going to drop material down into West Berlin from West Germany, you see, and give them supplies, okay? And they came in every single day dropping in supplies. It was so successful that the Soviets had to just finally say, well, never mind, y'all. This is a great picture right here. This is an American plane. And the pilots would notice as they were flying over that the children would stop in certain locations to wave at them and to thank them for dropping all the supplies. And so one of the guys came along and he said, oh, I'm going to give something special to the children. And he actually dropped down for them chocolate bars. So I was going to drop chocolate bars on y'all today so you could eat these while we were talking about these things. So I think they ended up calling him the Candy Man. We have an election in 1948, so Truman is going to run again, and he's going to run against that same guy that Roosevelt lost to, so Dewey. And it's kind of interesting here. We did have, y'all are going to read about this in your reading about what's known as the Dixiecrats. A Southern guy named Strom Thurmond is going to run under the Dixiecrat name, and he's a Democrat, but with more Southern, some people would say racist even. So you read on that and see what you think about Strom Thurmond. He was a senator from that area for a long, long time, South Carolina, a long, long time, even after this event that took place. Notice he did get a popular vote here, and then even, 39 electoral votes, which was probably, took away from the votes that Dewey got. All right. But notice we have 57% going to Truman. Now, this was a very, very close election, it turned out. So close that the call was made for Dewey to win. So here's Truman holding up the newspaper that says Dewey defeats Truman. And the next day they found out, that was a little bit of a premature headline right there. Truman actually won. So Truman became president in his own right, and he developed what is known as the Truman Doctrine. And that was essentially the containment, if you will, I'm going to use that word, containment of communism. He saw communism as the big bad guy out there now. The Nazis were gone, but we have these communists who want to take over the world just as much as Hitler had wanted to. And he saw that as the domino effect, that if small countries go, the rest of the countries will go. And there's what he wanted to do right there, was stop it. Stop it so that the rest of the countries in various locations, namely actually in the Pacific region, would not go communist. Which began what is known as the Cold War, a very icy relationship between America and the communist nation, namely the USSR, the United Soviet Socialist Republic, Russia, if you will. And the Cold War now is going to go on for some time. There's an arms race. We're building up different, weaponry in case we should go to actual hot war. And the communism is what we're afraid of. Here we are in Indochina. So this area is going to have communist ideas. And the reason is because China had gone communist with Mao. And they are now going to try to spread out, because communists they're always trying to gain more and more and more. So we see Russia the bear here is going to reach down to all these areas. And here's Uncle Sam saying, whoa, 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 whoa. So that's Truman with his Truman Doctrine saying, stop, we don't want that to happen. So we're going to see in a few weeks about how Vietnam we're going to try to stop the communist spread in Vietnam. And there's going to be a war there. So we called this the Red Menace. Communism going everywhere. So there was a Red Scare here in America. We knew, sadly, the Russians, I think we'll talk about in a minute, the Russians got the technology to make a nuclear bomb. Only the Americans had it. And so we had a corner on that market. There was a spy who actually took information from Los Alamos and sold it to the Russians. And they had that. So now that we know that the Russians have the technology, we know that they could develop a nuclear bomb and drop it on us. And so that became this Red Scare. We're scared to death. Remember, we've had Red Scares before, concerned about communism in America. Remember the Sacco and Vanzetti case and that kind of thing. But now we're looking at kind of a hysteria. People are building bomb shelters in their backyards that they can go into. And then came about this idea of duck and cover. So this is taught to school children. You would have gone to school and had a drill, like sometimes we'll have a fire drill. This drill would have been the duck and cover, and here is the little ad for it. It's kind of weird.
Deedle-dum-dum, deedle-dum-dum, deedle-dum-dum. There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and cover, ducked and cover.
He did what we all must learn to do.
You and you
And you
and you, duck and cover.
Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and cover. This is...
All right. So now schools. I'm going to show you now a little GIF, I guess it's called. Right here they are, duck and cover. Right, they're all going to get under their desk, get by the wall, get under the table. Right. So they get in either a blast or an alarm of some sort. Do you think that getting under your desk or your table is going to save you from an atomic blast? Yeah. Fortunately, we didn't have to have that. So what are we going to do about these communists that are around? What are there communists in the nation of America? That's the big question here. Well, this man thought for sure that communists were all over our nation. His name is J. Edgar Hoover, and he is the head of the FBI. And he said, I will get rid of these communists. And he started a huge campaign of gathering information, of making these dossiers and these lists of people who had suspicious activity that they might actually be communists. Now, communism was a bona fide political position. It would be maybe a liberal position. There was a communist party. It didn't do very well in elections and things like this. But now all of a sudden, if you had any connection at all with anyone who considered themselves part of the Communist Party, you're going to be suspect. And this guy would be making a file on you, even if you just knew somebody who was in there. And this man is a senator from Wisconsin. His name is Joseph McCarthy. He took to heart all the stuff that Hoover was doing, and he decided to have a committee formed that would do an investigation. All right, so bringing investigation, start calling people before Congress to ask if they know about any communist activity that's going on, because these communists could very well ruin our country from within, right? And already the communists had the information from the bomb, so could they get other information from us? And this was the name of his committee, the House Un-American Activities Committee. And he's going to bring in different witnesses to tell what's going on in their sector. And probably the most affected area by this was actually Hollywood, California. People who are making movies, movie stars, movie directors, writers. These kind of people were suspected of being communists. Walt Disney came to be a witness, and he was a witness who was friendly to the McCarthy side, and he said, yes, this is just my words, yes, there are communists in Hollywood. He believed that there were communists in Hollywood. Alger Hiss was actually accused of being a communist, and he actually had a trial, and I believe he was found guilty of communist activities. Ethel and Julia Rosenberg were the ones who stole the information from Los Alamos, New Mexico. And they took that information and sold it to the Russians. These two were tried for treason. They were discovered, actually, I think it was her brother or his brother, one of the brothers actually worked in the Manhattan Project and was able to secret out some of the information. That information was indeed given to the Russians. These two were tried for treason against America. They were found guilty, and they were both executed as traitors. As we look back now at the evidence, there's lots of evidence to show that Julius Rosenberg, the man, was indeed guilty. We're not sure about Ethel and how much she knew, however. This is going to bring about, the Truman Doctrine is going to bring about a war. We're trying to stop the spread of communism. Communism is going to be spread from China to North Korea, and then South Korea, which had been set apart in 1945. This was one of those things, just like Germany had been divided between the Russians and the Allies, so was Korea. So North Korea Russia got that, and South, because remember Japan owned it at the time of the war. So now, because Japan's been defeated, Russia gets the northern part, the Allies get the southern part. So we have North and South Korea. That's that partition that was made at the 38th parallel. Well, the leader of the North Koreans, his name is Kim Il-sung. He's the grandfather, I believe, of the guy who's there now. With the support of Stalin, of course, he decided, the whole peninsula should be united as one, and I think it should be united under me, Kim Il-sung. So he made military incursions. At first, they made huge advances. Okay, so they're going to move down from Pyongyang, which is the capital of North Korea, down into Seoul, all the way down. They're actually going to push all the way down. We're going to watch a little video. And the only thing that was the Allies were left here was in Pusan. Then the Americans said, we will put a stop to this, and they hired a guy. Who'd they hire? Here he is. Douglas MacArthur comes in to save the day. All right. And he actually came in while the North Koreans had come all the way down here, and the Allies were stuck right over here in this little area. The landing by MacArthur was made right up here. Okay, so smack in the middle of where the communists had come in. It's called Incheon, and it's the Incheon landing, and it was a huge success. And I thought I had a video on it. Okay, here we go. And then they move in, the 8th Army comes up, and they're going to attack up in the northern part of Korea, and this is called the Chosin Reservoir. All right, also known as Frozen Chosin. Horrible, horrible. Here's the reservoir right here. You can see the red is the Americans coming in. Is that right? Nope. Looks like the red is the Chinese. So our guys are holed up here, and they're going to be attacked by the Chinese. And it was freezing cold. Our poor guys, they were, wrapping their feet, similar to that Battle of the Bulge, wrapping their feet up and this kind of thing. Here they are, just in the snow, trying to stay warm. It was horrible. I thought I had a video on this. Let's see, is one of these a video? Guess not. Okay, here we go.
The Korean War, June 25, 1950 through July 27, 1953. At the end of World War II in 1945, Korea was freed from Japanese control. North Korea was occupied by the Soviets, while the South was occupied by American forces. By 1948, the country was divided in half at the 38th parallel, with the capitalist South ruled by Syngman Rhee and the communist North ruled by Kim Il-sung. The Soviet troops withdrew from Korea in 1948, and U.S. troops withdrew in 1949. However, North and South Korea, as enemies of one another, would not accept the border between them as permanent. The North Koreans attacked South Korea on June 25, 1950, advancing across the 38th parallel. Around 75,000 troops of the North Korean People's Army defeated the Republic of Korea's army with success, capturing the capital city of Seoul, then occupying the whole of South Korea except for Pusan. This was a problem, as President Truman in the United States wanted to contain the spread of communism by preventing the domino effect. That is, if Korea fell, so would other countries to the ideology. South Korea appealed for support, and the United States pushed a resolution through the United Nations Security Council. The USSR did not use its veto power, as it was boycotting the council because the new communist China was not accepted. In China's seat was the pro-US Chinese nationalist government of Taiwan. An appeal was made by the Security Council for North Korea to withdraw its troops, but was ignored. As a result, approval was granted for a UN army made up of an international force of 16 nations to send help to South Korea, commanded by General Douglas MacArthur. The UN troops, composed mainly of Americans, landed in South Korea in early July, but were soon pushed back on the defense by the North Korean forces, forming a perimeter around Pusan to defend the line until reinforcements arrived in August. Now that their position was strengthened, MacArthur went on the offensive. On September 15th, the U.S. Marines X-Corps launched an amphibious assault at Incheon. The North Korean troops were pushed back on the retreat over the 38th parallel, and soon Seoul was recaptured along with the whole of South Korea by the end of the month. Now, MacArthur was to go beyond the initial idea of containment. Truman, worried of a Chinese response, nevertheless approved, and UN troops moved into North Korea on October 7, 1950. On October 12th, they captured Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, and then the Yalu River, which was the border with communist China. China retaliated by helping the North Koreans, sending 250,000 Chinese troops. The UN troops, overwhelmed by this new force, were pushed out of North Korea with heavy losses. By January 1951, Chinese and North Korean troops had captured Seoul. General MacArthur wanted to use the atom bomb on China and was dismissed for insubordination by President Truman, who went back to a policy of containment. In June 1951, more UN troops were sent to Korea. Eventually, driving the North Korean army to the 38th parallel and stabilizing the front. Now, a stalemate set in. In July, peace talks began, but a compromise could not be found. Meanwhile, fighting continued, and American pilots fought in the air against Soviet pilots using Chinese jet fighters and wearing Chinese uniforms. General Dwight D. Eisenhower took over as president in early 1953 and sought an end to the war. After 2 years of negotiation, an armistice was signed on July 27, 1953, at Panmunjom on the 38th parallel. A demilitarized zone was set up, which stands to this day.
Okay.
Subscribe.
There we go. So this is how it worked. Okay. Originally, the North Koreans invaded. All right. So unprovoked, by the way. Notice that Seoul is way to the north right here. So that was taken almost immediately. Pushed all the way down to Pusan, right? So here we are in September. And then the American troops come in, have a little trouble, but then we have the Incheon landing. And they push the North Koreans back up this way. Okay, so Truman wanted containment. So he wanted the American troops to stop right here. Well, MacArthur ended up going up into North Korea. So there's where Chosin was, frozen Chosin right up in there, and came up here, up to the Yalu. And so the Yalu, at this point, is where Truman's saying, what are you doing? Why are you continuing on? We wanted to just contain this. That's when he suggested using the atomic bomb and this kind of thing, and it got just too difficult. That's when Truman had to fire him. He had to fire Douglas MacArthur. So then they moved back out down to this 38th parallel, and they set up this new deal right here. So this black line right here is the way it still is basically today. It's called the DMZ, or the Demilitarized Zone, the border between North and South Korea. South Korea has become a powerhouse of Western type of democracy, and North Korea, of course, is still communist, and the people there suffer very greatly because of it. All right, I think I have, yes, another video to tell us why did we do Korea.
Mention the Korean War today and most people will look at you with a blank stare. At the time it was fought, just 5 years after World War II ended, everyone recognized it as a world-shaping conflict, a stark confrontation between the forces of democracy and communism. It began on June 25, 1950, when Soviet-backed communist North Korea crossed the 38th parallel and invaded its U.S.-backed anti-communist South Korean neighbor. Within weeks, the communists had nearly absorbed the entire country. The United States at first was confused over whether it should or even could respond. America had slashed its military budget after the end of World War II and was short both men and equipment. It still had not awakened fully to the expansionist threat of Soviet Russia. The Soviets, buoyed by their own recent development of an atomic bomb and Mao Zedong's communist victory in China, sensed America's lack of resolve and encouraged the North's aggression. Yet within weeks, President Harry Truman rushed troops to save the shrinking Allied perimeter at Pusan on the southern tip of the Korean peninsula. By late September 1950, General Douglas MacArthur had successfully completed the Incheon landings and launched counterattacks. He quickly reclaimed the entire South and sent American-led United Nations forces far into North Korea to reunite the entire peninsula, only to be surprised when hundreds of thousands of Chinese Red Army troops crossed the Yalu River at the Chinese border and sent the outnumbered Americans reeling back into South Korea. Thanks to the genius of General Matthew Ridgway, who arrived to assume supreme command in South Korea in December 1950, over the next 100 days, U.S.-led UN forces pushed the communists back across the 38th parallel. The fighting was fierce. Seoul, the capital of South Korea, exchanged hands between communist and U.S.-led forces 5 times before it was finally secured. During the years 1952 and 1953, the war grew static, neither side able to deliver a knockout blow. Eventually, the conflict ended with a tense armistice in July 1953. For over the next 60 years, a Cold War persisted between the Stalinist North and what by the 1980s had evolved into the democratic economic powerhouse of South Korea. Over 35,000 Americans died in the Korean War. The war marked the first major armed conflict of the nuclear age, and one in which the United States had not clearly defeated the enemy and thus not dictated terms of surrender. Was fighting the Korean War and restoring the South without uniting the entire peninsula worth the huge cost in blood and treasure? The natural dividend of saving the South was the evolution of today's democratic and prosperous South Korea that has given its 50 million citizens undreamed of freedom and affluence, and has blessed the world with top-flight products from the likes of Hyundai, Kia, LG, and Samsung. South Korea is a model global citizen and a strong ally of the U.S., and stands in sharp contrast to the communist regime in the North that has starved and murdered millions of its own people and caused untold mischief in the world community. Had it not been for U.S. intervention and support to the South, the current monstrous regime in Pyongyang would now rule all of Korea, ensuring its nuclear-armed dictatorship even greater power and resources. The American effort to save South Korea also sent a message to both Communist China and the Soviet Union that the free world, under U.S. leadership, would no longer tolerate communist military takeovers of free nations. The resulting deterrence policy helped to keep the communist world from attempting similar surprise attacks on Japan, Taiwan, and Western Europe. Finally, the Korean War awakened the United States to the dangers of disarmament and isolationism, and led to the bipartisan foreign policy of containment of global communism that in 1989 finally led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and with it victory in the Cold War. The Korean War was an incomplete American victory in its failure to liberate North Korea and unite the peninsula, but a victory nonetheless, and not just from a military perspective, but from a moral one as well. The reason 35,000 Americans died in Korea was to keep at least half the Korean people free. Korea did not have a single material resource that would have benefited America. The Korean War merits more than a blank stare. It deserves to be remembered and studied with pride. I'm Victor Davis Hanson of the Hoover Institution for Prager University.
All right, once again, a good perspective to figure out what was really going on there. There was an election in 1952, and look who is running. We have Dwight Eisenhower is a Republican. Truman doesn't run again, and so he's going to be facing against a Democrat named Adlai Stevenson. And Eisenhower was a huge, war hero, very well known, and it was an easy win for him. Electorally, it was a landslide. So then we have Dwight Eisenhower is going to become our next president, number 34, and next week we're going to look at his America, Eisenhower's America, the America of the 1950s. Kind of some fun stuff. So we're done for today, y'all. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will hopefully see you real soon. Okay, bye, y'all.